He stood on the porch holding the deed like a trophy, grinning at me while the movers rolled my father's piano onto the truck. "You should have acted faster, Maurice. It's mine now." The words felt unreal. This was the house my parents built, the home I cared for after Dad died, the one he hadn't even visited in months. My mother sat on the couch, wringing her hands as if she'd known something I didn't. A neighbor whispered, "I thought you owned it." I couldn't answer. My name was still on the old paperwork. But Dorian had a notarized will in his hand, one I had never seen before. My name is Maurice Calloway, and that was the moment I realized I'd been outmaneuvered in my own family. 2 weeks earlier, my brother had convinced me to hand him a few of Dad's documents to organize the estate. I trusted him. He was charming, persuasive, and everyone's favorite. I didn't know he'd rewritten the narrative of our lives while smiling across the dinner table. The movers didn't even look at me. They just lifted my father's piano, the one I learned to play on, and carried it out the front door while my brother stood there, smirking, deed in hand. "You should have read the will, Maurice," he said. "It's mine now." My mother sat in the hallway, crying into her sleeve. Neighbors whispered on the lawn. My keys felt useless in my palm. That was the moment I realized everything had been taken from me. My name is Maurice Calloway, and this house wasn't just walls and furniture. It was my father's promise. The one my brother had just stolen with a pen and a smile. I'd spent the last 3 years caring for this place after Mom moved to her sister's house in Nevada. I'd painted the shutters, fixed the leaky roof, planted roses in the garden Dad always loved. Dorian hadn't visited once during Dad's final months in hospice. Not once, but now he stood on the porch like he owned it, because apparently he did. The deed in his hand looked official, stamped and notarized. My stomach twisted as I watched him hand instructions to the movers. This couldn't be real. 2 days earlier, I sat in a stiff chair at the lawyer's office. My brother lounged across from me, confident and relaxed. The lawyer's tone was formal but final. "The family home is hereby left to Dorian Calloway." My ears rang. My throat locked. I whispered, "That's not possible. Dad promised me this house." Dorian smiled faintly, tapping the polished table with his fingers. "Promises don't stand in probate, sis." The lawyer, an older man named Mr. Brennan, adjusted his glasses and continued reading the will. Everything else was divided fairly. Dad's savings split between us, his car going to our cousin. But the house, the only thing that really mattered, went entirely to Dorian. I felt my hands go numb. "When was this will written?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mr. Brennan glanced at the document. 3 weeks before your father's passing. It's properly notarized and witnessed." 3 weeks. That was when Dad could barely hold a pen, when he was on heavy medication, when Dorian had suddenly started visiting the hospice center every day after months of absence. I drove home numb, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping me from unraveling. The house lights were still on when I pulled into the driveway. My father's photo stared at me from the mantel through the window. "Did you really give it to him?" I whispered to the air. The only answer was the quiet creak of the old wood floors I once promised to protect. I walked through the rooms slowly that night, touching everything. The kitchen table where Dad taught me to play chess. The window seat where I used to read on rainy afternoons. The back porch where he'd drink his coffee every morning, watching the sun rise over the mountains. Every corner held a memory, and now all of it belonged to someone who'd barely cared. Sleep didn't come that night. I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how this had happened. Dad and I had talked about the house just months before he got sick. "It's yours, Maurice," he'd said clearly. "You're the one who stayed. You're the one who cares." Those words echoed in my mind as dawn broke through my window. I started digging through drawers the next morning and found a document my brother had once asked me to sign to help with taxes. It wasn't about taxes. It was a power of attorney, notarized and dated 3 weeks before Dad's final hospital stay. My signature stared back at me, neat and naive. He'd used me to authorize his control over Dad's affairs. My hands trembled as I read through the document. I'd signed it in Dorian's kitchen during a family dinner. He'd been so casual about it, sliding it across the table between the salad and dessert. "Just a formality," he'd said with that charming smile. "Makes it easier to handle Dad's medical bills." I'd trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? He was my brother. But this power of attorney gave him access to everything. Dad's bank accounts, his medical decisions, his legal documents. I felt sick realizing how easily I'd handed him the keys to take whatever he wanted. The date on the document was particularly damning. Dad had still been somewhat coherent then, but Dorian had already been planning his next move. Our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Kellen, stopped me by the fence that afternoon. "Your brother was here the day before your father passed," she said softly, her eyes full of concern. I froze, my heart pounding. "He had a man with him. They were talking about paperwork." Her weathered hand touched my arm gently. She'd lived next door for 30 years and knew our family well. "He said something about making things official," Mrs. Kellen continued, glancing nervously toward the house. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now with all this happening, I thought you should know." I thanked her, my mind racing. Who was the man with Dorian? Why had they come here instead of the hospice center where Dad was? That evening, I called the hospice center. The nurse who'd cared for Dad during his final days remembered me. "Your brother visited frequently those last few weeks," she confirmed. "Always with documents. Your father was pretty out of it by then, but your brother would spend hours in that room." Hours doing what, I wondered. Certainly not comforting a dying man. At the bank the next morning, I asked about the mortgage account. The clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, hesitated before pulling up the records. "The property's ownership transfer was filed 2 days before your father's death," she said quietly, watching my reaction carefully. 2 days before. I felt my hands go cold. Dorian hadn't just acted fast. He'd acted while Dad was still alive, but completely unable to understand what was happening. "How is that possible?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "My father was in hospice. He couldn't even sign his own name by then." The clerk looked uncomfortable. "The signature was notarized. Everything appeared legitimate in our system." But it wasn't legitimate. It couldn't be. Dad's hands had been shaking so badly those final days that nurses had to help him hold a water glass. I requested copies of all the documents related to the transfer. The clerk printed them reluctantly, sliding them across the counter in a manila folder. "I'm sorry," she whispered as I turned to leave. Her sympathy meant something, but it didn't change the facts staring at me from those papers. My brother had stolen our family home while our father lay dying. In Dad's office that night, buried under yellowed folders and old tax returns, I found a small wooden box. Inside were birthday cards, old family photos, and a flash drive labeled House in Dad's shaky handwriting. My heart raced as I plugged it into my laptop. A single document appeared, dated just 4 months before Dad entered hospice. The title read, "Will, Updated Draft." The first line made tears spring to my eyes. "To my daughter, Maurice, who never left my side, I leave the family home and all its contents." The will was detailed, clearly written, and unmistakably in Dad's voice. He explained his reasoning, how I'd been the one to care for the property, how I'd visited him regularly, how Dorian had disappeared from his life years ago except when he needed money. This was the real will, Dad's actual final wishes. The document Dorian had presented to Mr. Brennan was a forgery, or at the very least, something Dad had been manipulated into signing when he wasn't capable of understanding. I saved 3 copies of the file immediately, emailing one to myself and storing another on a separate drive. This was my proof. I called Mr. Brennan, the lawyer who'd read the will. He sighed heavily when I explained what I'd found. "Your brother came in with a signed version after your father's passing. It looked legitimate," he admitted. His voice carried a hint of doubt now. "Did you verify it with the hospice center?" I asked, already knowing the answer. A long pause followed. "No," he finally admitted. "It was notarized privately. Your brother presented it with all the proper documentation. I had no reason to question it at the time." But he should have questioned it. A man dying in hospice, suddenly changing his will to favor the son who'd been absent for years. That should have raised red flags everywhere. I told Mr. Brennan about the flash drive, about the updated draft that clearly stated Dad's wishes. "Can you look into the notary who signed off on Dorian's version?" I asked. "Something isn't right about any of this." Mr. Brennan agreed to investigate, though his tone suggested he wasn't optimistic about what we'd find. Still, it was a start. Comparing the two wills side by side on my kitchen table, I noticed something crucial. Dad's signature on Dorian's version looped upward, the way he used to sign when he was healthy and strong. But the version on my flash drive, dated later, showed the trembling hand I remembered from his final months. The signature was shaky, uncertain, but undeniably his. The difference was stark. Anyone who'd seen Dad in his last year would recognize that his handwriting had changed dramatically. The Parkinson's disease that had complicated his final months made his hands shake constantly. Yet Dorian's version showed a signature that looked exactly like Dad's from 10 years ago. How had the notary not noticed this? I took photos of both signatures, making careful notes about the dates and the obvious differences in handwriting. This wasn't just about interpretation or family disagreement. This was evidence of forgery. Dad couldn't have signed that document with such a steady hand during his final weeks. It was physically impossible given his condition. Dorian invited the family for dinner the following Saturday to clear the air. He'd already moved some of his furniture into the house, treating it like his personal property. The gathering felt wrong from the moment I arrived. He gave a speech about responsibility and Dad's wishes, his voice smooth and confident. Every word tasted false in my mouth. Relatives nodded along, some looking uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge him. Our cousin Alex kept glancing at me with concern but stayed silent. When I finally asked where the notary was who'd witnessed Dad's signature, Dorian said casually, "He's overseas, retired to Spain right after." How convenient. A witness who couldn't be questioned, conveniently out of the country. I caught Alex's uneasy glance across the table and knew he didn't believe Dorian either. But speaking up would mean family conflict, and everyone was too uncomfortable to risk it. They wanted to believe Dorian because it was easier than facing the possibility that he'd stolen from his dying father. I left early, unable to stomach another minute of his performance. A nurse from the hospice unit called me privately the next day. Her name was Tracy, and she'd been one of Dad's primary caregivers during his final weeks. "I overheard your father talking to his lawyer the day before he passed," she said, her voice hushed like she was sharing a dangerous secret. "He said he left the house to you. He wanted you to feel secure after everything you'd done for him." My breath caught in my throat. "Would you testify to that?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. There was a brief pause on the line. "I already wrote it in his discharge notes," Tracy replied firmly. "Your father was very clear about his wishes when he was lucid. He talked about you constantly, about how grateful he was that you'd stayed close." She explained that Dad had mentioned Dorian only once in her presence, expressing sadness that his son had drifted away over the years. "Your father never would have left everything to someone he barely saw," Tracy insisted. "I've worked hospice for 15 years. I know when patients are making clear decisions and when they're being manipulated. Your father was manipulated." Her words were the validation I desperately needed. A realtor called my cell phone that Tuesday afternoon, asking if I wanted to speed up closing. I felt my blood run cold. "What closing?" I asked, though dread was already pooling in my stomach. She sounded startled, confused by my question. "Your brother said you were relocating. He's listed the property for sale. I have buyers interested already." I hung up before I screamed. He wasn't just taking the home. He was selling it, erasing every trace of Dad's memory, turning decades of family history into cash. The house had been in our family for 40 years. Dad had built the back deck himself. Mom had planted every tree in the yard, and Dorian was selling it like it meant nothing. I called him immediately, my hands shaking with rage. "You're selling Dad's house?" My voice was sharper than I'd intended. He laughed, actually laughed. "It's my house now, Maurice. I can do whatever I want with it. The market's good right now. No point letting it sit empty." Empty. As if I hadn't lived there. As if Dad's memory didn't fill every room. While cleaning Dad's computer files that evening, searching for any other evidence, I found an email trail between Dorian and Mr. Brennan from months ago. One subject line read, "Revised copy for signature." Attached was a draft of the will, unfinalized and clearly marked as preliminary. But Dorian had forwarded it to someone else with a message that made my blood boil. "Got it signed. Moving forward." He'd lied straight to the executor. The draft wasn't final. Dad had never approved that version. But Dorian had taken it, forged a signature, and presented it as legitimate. The email chain showed his planning, his manipulation, his complete disregard for Dad's actual wishes. I screenshot everything, saving it to multiple locations. This was criminal fraud, not just a family disagreement. I spent hours that night reading through every email, every document on Dad's computer. The picture that emerged was clear and damning. Dorian had been planning this for months, maybe longer. He'd positioned himself carefully, gained access through the power of attorney I'd foolishly signed, and then executed his plan while Dad was too weak to fight back. The notary listed on Dorian's document had supposedly moved to Spain, but I wasn't giving up that easily. Through a mutual friend, I tracked down his ex-wife, a woman named Sandra who still lived in our town. She agreed to meet me at a coffee shop, looking nervous but determined. "My ex-husband did something terrible," she said immediately, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. She explained that her ex-husband, the notary, had stamped the document after Dad died. "Your brother promised him $5,000 in cash," Sandra revealed, her voice shaking. "I heard them on the phone. Your brother said nobody would check the dates carefully. He was right, wasn't he?" She pulled out her phone, hands trembling, and showed me screenshots she'd saved. Text messages between her ex and Dorian discussing payment and timing. "I kept these just in case," Sandra continued. "I knew it was wrong. I told him not to do it, but he said it was just paperwork, that it didn't really hurt anyone. But it did hurt someone. It hurt me. It hurt Dad's memory. I asked if she'd be willing to testify about what she knew. Sandra nodded firmly. "Yes, my ex shouldn't have done this. Your father deserved better." My mother, overwhelmed by the family conflict, called me from Nevada. "Let it go, Maurice," she pleaded, her voice tired and defeated. "The house is just a house. You're tearing the family apart over wood and nails." But she didn't understand. This wasn't about the physical structure. It was about Dad's wishes, about justice, about refusing to let Dorian steal and lie without consequences. "Mom, Dad wanted me to have the house," I explained as gently as I could. "He told the hospice nurses, he wrote it in a will on his computer. Dorian forged documents to take it." She was silent for a long moment. "I just want peace," she finally whispered. "I'm too old for this fighting." I understood her exhaustion, but I couldn't let it go, not when I had proof of what Dorian had done. That night, I printed every document, every timestamp, every piece of evidence I'd gathered. I pinned them to my apartment wall, creating a timeline of Dorian's deception. The pattern was crystal clear. He'd manipulated Dad when he was most vulnerable, forged signatures, paid off a notary, and lied to everyone. This wasn't a family squabble. It was fraud, plain and simple. Someone slid an envelope under my apartment door late one night. I heard the soft thud but didn't reach it until morning. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note that made my heart race. "He paid someone to falsify the witness signature. Look closely at page 3 of the will." The note wasn't signed, but someone clearly wanted me to know the truth. The USB drive contained surveillance footage from the parking lot of Mr. Brennan's law office. The timestamp showed the day after Dad's funeral. In the grainy video, I watched Dorian meet with a man I didn't recognize. They talked for several minutes, and then the man handed Dorian what looked like documents. Money changed hands. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes, but it was enough. I didn't know who'd sent me this footage, but I was grateful. Maybe it was someone from the law office who'd suspected something was wrong. Maybe it was another family member who'd figured out what Dorian had done. Whoever it was had just given me the final piece of evidence I needed. This wasn't just suspicious anymore. It was documented proof of conspiracy. I drove to Dorian's new apartment across town, the USB drive clutched in my hand. When he answered the door, I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You forged it," I said quietly, watching his face carefully. For just a moment, uncertainty flashed in his eyes. Then his usual cocky smile returned. "You can't prove anything, Maurice. It's my word against yours. Who do you think people will believe?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. The expression felt strange on my face, but satisfying. "Not anymore," I said simply. His smile faltered. I held up the USB drive. "I have footage of you paying someone to falsify documents. I have emails showing you lied about Dad's will. I have testimony from the hospice nurse and the notary's ex-wife. This isn't your word against mine anymore." The color drained from Dorian's face. He tried to recover, stammering something about misunderstandings and legal complications. But we both knew the truth. I'd already sent copies of everything to Mr. Brennan that morning. His carefully constructed fraud was crumbling. "You're done," I said softly, and turned away before he could respond. Behind me, I heard his door slam hard enough to rattle the frame. Within days, the house listing was marked under dispute on real estate websites. The sale froze immediately. Dorian's offers from interested buyers collapsed. I heard through family members that his friends had stopped answering his calls, distancing themselves from the scandal that was beginning to spread through our small town. He came by my apartment once, standing outside my door for several minutes. Through the peephole, I watched him shift his weight from foot to foot, raising his hand to knock, then lowering it again. He looked smaller somehow, deflated. The confidence that had always surrounded him like armor was gone. Part of me wanted to open the door to hear what he'd say, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not while the wound was still so fresh. He finally left without knocking, shoulders hunched against the evening cold. I sat on my couch for a long time afterward, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. This was my brother. Someone I'd grown up with, shared childhood memories with, but he'd chosen greed over family. He'd stolen from our dying father. Whatever happened next, he'd brought on himself. The forensic handwriting analyst Mr. Brennan hired delivered her report 3 weeks later. I sat in his office while he read the findings aloud. "The signature on the contested will shows characteristics inconsistent with the claimed date of signing," he read. "Analysis indicates the signature was likely traced or copied from an earlier document. It lacks the natural variation and pressure points expected from an original signature." She'd confirmed what I already knew. The signature was fake. I exhaled shakily, feeling years of tension leave my body. All those nights doubting myself, wondering if maybe I was wrong, if maybe Dad had changed his mind without telling me. All the guilt and confusion erased by scientific truth. The analyst had compared the signature to dozens of documents Dad had signed throughout his life, including medical forms from his final weeks in hospice. "The tremor evident in late-period signatures is completely absent from the disputed will," Mr. Brennan continued. "This would be medically impossible given the patient's documented Parkinson's disease." It was over. The proof was undeniable. Dorian had forged our father's signature, and now we had expert testimony confirming it. Justice was finally within reach. The courtroom smelled like old paper and furniture polish when we gathered for the hearing. I'd never been inside a real courtroom before, and the formal atmosphere made my heart pound. I laid out all my evidence on the table in front of me. The original will from Dad's computer, Tracy's written testimony, Sandra's screenshots, the surveillance footage, and the handwriting analyst's report. Each piece told part of the story. Dorian's lawyer, an expensive attorney from Phoenix, flipped through the documents with growing concern. His face grew paler with each page. The judge, a stern-looking woman with gray hair pulled back tightly, reviewed everything methodically. The silence in the courtroom felt heavy and absolute. When she finally looked up, her gaze settled on Dorian. "Did you sign your father's name to this will?" she asked directly. Dorian opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words came out. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but what could he say? The evidence surrounded him from all sides. His silence spoke louder than any confession. The judge's expression hardened as she waited for an answer that never came. "I see," she said finally, her voice carrying clear disapproval. The news spread through our town within hours of the hearing. "Local man under investigation for forged family will," read the headline in our community newspaper. Dorian's small accounting firm, where he'd worked for 15 years, quietly asked him to resign. His clients started requesting new accountants. His friends disappeared, avoiding him at the grocery store and church, anywhere they might run into him. Mom finally called me, her voice trembling with emotion. "I didn't know, Maurice. I swear I didn't know what he'd done." I believed her. She'd always wanted to see the best in both her children, even when one of us didn't deserve it. "He's still my son," she said, crying softly. "But what he did to your father to you, I can't defend it." Neither could I, and I'd stopped trying weeks ago. The family fractured along predictable lines. Some relatives sided with Dorian, claiming I was being too harsh, that family should forgive family. Others supported me, understanding that forgiveness didn't mean letting fraud go unpunished. Holiday gatherings would be complicated for years to come, but some things mattered more than comfortable family dinners. Truth mattered. Justice mattered. Dad's memory mattered. I returned to the house one last time while the court finalized the proceedings. The restraining order prevented Dorian from entering, so I had the place to myself. The air smelled like dust and lemon polish, exactly how it had always smelled when Dad was alive. I walked through each room slowly, touching familiar surfaces, remembering. In Dad's old office, I sat at his desk, the same place where he'd written that updated will on his computer. The chair still adjusted to his preferred height. His reading glasses still sat in the top drawer. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to really cry. Not angry tears or frustrated tears, but grief. Pure grief for the father I'd lost and the brother I'd apparently never really known. The house felt like it was breathing around me, settling into its bones after weeks of turmoil. Dad's presence still lingered in unexpected places. The pencil marks on the kitchen doorframe measuring my childhood height. The repair patch in the living room wall from when I'd accidentally thrown a baseball indoors at age 8. These were the memories worth fighting for. The court's final ruling came on a Tuesday morning. Mr. Brennan called me at work with the news. "The contested will has been ruled invalid," he said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "The original version found on your father's computer has been accepted as his true final wishes. The house is legally yours, Mari's. Additionally, Dorian has been ordered to repay any profits he gained through the attempted sale." I had to sit down, my legs suddenly weak. It was over, really over. The house was mine, just like Dad had wanted. Justice had prevailed despite Dorian's best efforts to steal and lie his way to an inheritance he didn't deserve. Mr. Brennan continued explaining the legal details, but I barely heard him. Relief washed over me in waves. Dorian didn't look at me when the final verdict was read in court. His shoulders sagged under the weight of his own choices and consequences. His expensive lawyer packed up his briefcase quickly, clearly eager to distance himself from a losing case. Some of the relatives who'd attended gasped softly, while others nodded in grim satisfaction. The truth had finally won. Over the following months, I watched Dorian's life unravel from a distance. He lost his professional accounting license after the investigation revealed he'd committed fraud. His bank accounts were frozen to ensure he could repay what he owed. Even the friends who'd once admired his confidence and charm avoided mentioning his name, as if he'd become a ghost. He moved out of state quietly about 6 months later, leaving Arizona for somewhere in Oregon. Mom heard from him occasionally, brief phone calls where he claimed to be starting over, working construction, living a simple life. He never apologized to me directly, never acknowledged what he'd done or the damage he'd caused. Maybe he couldn't face it. Maybe he genuinely believed he'd been in the right somehow. I found no joy in his downfall. Watching my brother lose everything didn't feel victorious. It just felt sad and wasteful. He could have been successful honestly. He could have built a real relationship with Dad during those final months. Instead, he'd chosen deception and theft, and now he lived with those consequences every day. Some lessons come too late and cost too much. Months after everything was settled, I stood on the porch of the home my father built. The sunset hit the windows just like it used to when Dad would whistle through the kitchen while cooking dinner. I'd spent weeks cleaning and repairing, erasing the traces of Dorian's brief occupation and restoring the house to how Dad would have wanted it. The house was mine again, not because I'd fought dirty or manipulated anyone, but because I'd refused to let injustice stand. Because I'd gathered proof and trusted the legal system to see the truth. Dad's piano sat in its proper place in the living room, and I ran my hand along the keys, soft and familiar. The sound echoed through the rooms like a welcome home. Justice, it turned out, didn't need noise or drama. It just needed time, patience, and someone willing to fight for what was right. I'd learned that some battles are worth having, no matter how painful. Some truths need to be exposed, no matter how much family drama they cause. And some promises, like the one Dad made to leave me this house, are worth defending with everything you have. I played a simple melody on the piano, one Dad had taught me 20 years ago. The notes floated through the open windows and out into the evening air. Somewhere, I hoped he could hear it and know that his wishes had been honored, that his daughter had fought for his memory, that love and truth had won in the end.